When I was about 18, I attended college in a rural mountain area of New Hampshire that mainly revolved around students who were science majors. It wasn't a big school, but the people were nice and the scenery was amazing, with the school being located next to the mountains. As you can imagine, the school tuition wasn't cheap and I definitely was no rich person. With my parents not having a lot of money, they could only afford to pay for my books, which meant that I had to find a way to pay for my tuition. Obviously, I couldn't pay out of pocket, so I took out a student loan and made a deal that I would pay it all back before I graduated. I looked online for a few local jobs that were hiring and eventually found a few people who needed a babysitter. Having lived near a relatively wealthy area where people were more generous in terms of pay and being someone who adored kids, I gladly accepted their offer. The child I'd be taking care of was a 9-year-old girl who I'll call Mel for privacy reasons. She seemed friendly enough, and the parents gave me a list of rules I needed to follow, which seemed simple. When they left, I kinda let Mel do her own thing while I caught up on some homework from school, as she really wasn't the social type. I made us some dinner, helped with her homework, and even did some drawing together to keep each other company. 10 p.m. hit, and I told Mel to start getting ready for bed while I made us some dessert. As I'm putting away the ice cream, I hear a loud and heavy knock at the front door. I opened the door and was greeted to a man I had never seen before, wearing torn jeans and a dirty white shirt. For whatever reason, he's holding a briefcase and claims that he was a plumber here to fix the water heater. Alarms start going off in my head, as this guy wore nothing that even resembled a plumber, and didn't even have a van or a truck from a licensed company. It was also strange that the parents didn't let me know if there was someone coming. I may have been young back then, but I definitely wasn't stupid. I tell him that I was the babysitter and that I never got told that someone would be coming, and asked if he could show some sort of identification. He tried avoiding my question and kept on insisting that he come in, to which I told him no and that he needed to leave. When I try closing the door on him, he puts his foot through the door, and I repeatedly tell him to leave or that I would call the cops. Thankfully, my tactic seemed to scare him off, as I then saw him pick up his suitcase and walk away, disappearing into the night. Mel then came out of the bathroom, and I then apologized, telling her that I was on the phone with a friend. We eat our dessert, and Mel goes right to bed while I stay up cleaning the kitchen. All of a sudden, I hear yet another knock at the door, and I open it. Standing there were 2 police officers, and I was immediately questioned by them. They had asked me if someone had came by to the house asking for anything. I then instantly remembered about the guy who came earlier, trying to let himself in, and I then gave a description. My description had matched with theirs, and they then told me to lock the doors and to not answer it for anyone. Apparently, the man who had come to the door was a serial rapist wanted for murder. Soon after, I called Mel's parents and told them about what had happened, and they came as soon as they could and paid me for the trouble. Police had given me an escort back home to make sure I was safe, and I was never asked to babysit Mel again.
When I was about 9 or so, my family and I moved into an old house. It was at least 70 years old, and it was still in pretty good condition for a house that old. The house was located in a very rural area of Kentucky. My parents would constantly be out either working or running errands. Being only 9, my parents didn't trust me to stay home alone, and they ended up hiring a babysitter to watch over me until one of my parents came home from work. His name was Rick, and he seemed like a really genuine person. Every day when I came home from school, Rick would always be at the house waiting for me with something to eat and let me watch TV so long as I got my homework done. Sometimes he'd even buy me Capri Suns if he thought I was doing well in school. I actually enjoyed spending time with Rick and even considered him as part of the family, considering how well he looked up to me. This continued on for about a good month or so before I finally saw Rick's true intentions. He started acting weird around me. He would play games that he would make up where we were both locked in a dimly lit room and pretend we're animals. He would always tell me and remind me how smart and beautiful I was and that he was always here for me. Coming from a guy who was 20 years older than me, I of course was uncomfortably creeped out. However, I didn't tell my parents, fearing that they'd think I was lying or trying to get Rick fired. His weird and creepy moves only became worse. Everything from, "I love the way you're dressed," to, "I like the way your hair feels." Being only 9 at the time, I still thought it was creepy, but didn't think of it as a threat or anything. I tried telling him to stop every now and then that I wasn't comfortable, and he'd immediately respond by trying to show remorse or sympathy for me, and then would change the subject or do something else. But as time progressed, his creepiness only grew more. Whether he was complimenting me based on how I looked or touching me inappropriately, and even with all the red flags, I still hadn't brought this up to my parents. We hadn't heard from Rick for a while after that, and my parents ended up getting me a new babysitter. One night I was getting ready for bed so I could wake up for school the next morning when my parents said they needed to speak to me. I walk over to the kitchen and see my mom and dad sitting down with concerned looks on their faces. My dad sat me down and started asking about Rick and if there was anything he was doing to put me in an uncomfortable position. He said that I wasn't in trouble, but that I needed to tell him the truth. I go on to explain how he touched me and talk about how randomly he told me how pretty I looked. Needless to say, both my parents called the police to make a report about it, and I never saw or heard from Rick again. It wasn't until a few years later that when we had moved to another state where the conversations were brought up again. My mom's eyes were opened wide as saucers and then told me something I didn't know. Now that I'm older, she finally revealed the whole story. Turns out Rick had watched over multiple kids other than me and would make them uncomfortable just as he did with me. Apparently a few parents were aware of this, and when the authorities searched his house, they found several photos and videotapes of illegal pornography. I won't go into any more detail other than that, but it was sickening to say the least. Thankfully, Rick was thrown in prison for a long time and he was never brought up again. I strongly believe that there is a special place in hell for him.
This happened when I was around 19 years old, when I was a freshman in college. During this time, I had gotten a job as a babysitter to keep up with my rent and all of my other additional expenses. Throughout my time as a babysitter, I had babysat many different kids and nothing strange or abnormal has ever happened. There was this one time, however, where I witnessed something I still can't even describe. I was getting paid a few $100 to watch over a couple's child for a few nights who was 2 years old at the time, named Ben. Ben was a lot to take care of and was one of those babies who would always whine over the smallest things. Whether it be trying to carry him or even going to check up on him, he'd always want to be left alone. At around 9 p.m., I went over to Ben's crib to find him fast asleep. The crib was located in the room adjacent to the room I'd be sleeping in, so it would be close enough for me to hear if something was wrong. I also had a baby monitor so I could check up on him once in a while. Fast forward to around 1 a.m., I start drifting off to sleep and slept for about a good hour or so, before waking up to the sound of the baby monitor making this distorted noise. I checked the little tablet and what I saw still terrifies me till this day. Standing in the middle of the floor was Ben looking up at the camera with a blank expression on his face, as if he knew he were being watched. I turned off the tablet and quietly walked into Ben's room, only to find him still fast asleep in his crib. I left the baby monitor turned off and didn't get a minute of sleep that night.
This story is told in the perspective of a female. When I was in my early to mid-20s, I got my first ever real job as a babysitter to help pay for my college tuition. My job wasn't too hard, but it could definitely be a hassle having to cope with certain kids depending on what age range they were. Throughout my years of babysitting, I had dealt with many different kids and even had my fair share of weird and strange ones. I'd been babysitting this one kid named David who was 10 at the time, which some may argue is too old for a sitter. However, the age didn't really matter in my opinion, and it was still money on the side. The parents seemed nice, if anything a bit odd, but they were the types of parents who were strict about rules and stuff. When I should put him to bed, what to feed him, things like that. He played upstairs in his room for most of the time while I was on the couch watching a few movies. His parents mentioned that he had a form of autism, so he wasn't too social with me unless I needed him. Fast forward a few hours later, and it was starting to get late, and then I go upstairs and politely tell David to go to bed as instructed. He surprisingly obeys, as a lot of the kids his age tend to complain, and I go backstairs to resume the movie I was watching. I'd say not even a minute later, I began to hear footsteps upstairs, directly above me. Thinking it was probably David using the restroom, I didn't think anything of it. However, the footsteps seemed to go back and forth across the second floor, so I was confused as to what the hell David was doing. I quietly tiptoe up the stairs and see David still dead asleep in his bed. When I go back inside the hallway, I noticed the door to his parents' bedroom was wide open and a light was on. Figuring that David may have left the light on in his room, I go inside to try and find the light switch and see someone hiding behind one of the dressers. The only reason I could see him was because he was revealing his right arm. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach as I noticed this and quietly walked out of the room and frantically woke David up. He wakes up in a bit of a mood, and I calmly tell him that there was someone in his parents' bedroom that I didn't know and that he needed to be quiet. I locked the door and began to loudly cuss myself when I hear footsteps approaching the door and stopping right in front of it. At this point, David started to hyperventilate, and I was doing everything I could to calm him down. All the while, whoever was behind the door started to knock ever so slowly. And at that point, I lost it and just started screaming at them not to come in and that I was armed. This didn't seem to faze him, as he then started laughing as if I were making a joke. What happened next is what I can only say was a gift from God. I could hear several sirens coming down the road in the distance, and I heard the man frantically run downstairs. However, he didn't get very fast as the police had managed to catch him and arrest him. Turns out that our neighbors saw this man break into the house through the back door with a key. The parents confirmed that they didn't know this man and didn't know how he'd gotten that key. After that night, I swore to myself that I would never babysit again.